TeacherStudent Lecture. My name is Aaron Train, and as one of the co-conveners of this conference, it's my great privilege to introduce you to this evening's speaker. Before I do so, there are a couple names I need to mention. When Jeff Bilbro asked me over a year ago to begin imagining with him what this conference might look like, I of course had no idea how much work was involved. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time is that Jeff would pretty much do all the hard work himself. As you all know, over last year, Jeff has organized every last detail, sent every last email, and along with his friends and colleagues at Spring Arbor, done everything to make this such a remarkable conference. So among other things, I have a newfound sympathy with and even an appreciation for that kid in class who just lets everyone else do the work. That kid knows, like I do now, that sometimes it's just better to let the Jeff Bilbros of the world do their thing. Jeff has given up himself in extraordinary ways that I don't think any of us can fully appreciate. And has done an extraordinary job organizing this conference. Would you please join me in thanking Jeff? And given that this is the Midwest Conference on Christianity and Literature, I want to also take just a minute to mention the name of someone who's a good mentor, a good friend to me and to many people in this room. The news of Roger Lundine's death this November came as an incredible shock to us all. Roger's scholarship and his gifts as a teacher were alive in every sense of the word. After years of service to the Academy, Roger's voice was as gentle, thoughtful, and inescapable as ever. His tenure as president of the Conference on Christianity and Literature was, in some ways, merely a way of formalizing a lifetime devoted to an intellectually rigorous and charitable exploration of the ways in which literature and Christian theology might serve to illuminate the other. As his and my good friend Jeremy Begbie has said, Roger's largeness was only exceeded by his largesse. Despite his extraordinary intellect, breadth of learning, and towering stature, Roger never made anyone feel small. You felt bigger in Roger's presence, more confident, more hopeful, more yourself. So we lost not only a leader and an exemplar and a clarion voice, but a good friend. And as I look at the faces out here this evening, I take no small comfort in knowing that in many ways, our task here tonight, this conference itself, is a living testament to Roger's life and work. Roger gave us all many gifts. Among those is the opportunity to reshare those gifts with each other. So I'm grateful for him, for the many ways you all continue to give life to his work. And finally, I'd like to say a few words about the speakers. Instead of reciting items from the CV, I'll save a few trees and add my voice to those you heard during dinner as a former student of his. Though as you can tell, I doubt there is such a thing as a former student. To do so, I'd like to tell you about the first time I had dinner with the Jeffrey family. It was an occasion that would be routine and unremarkable for him, from his perspective, but one that meant a great deal to me over the years. I was David's graduate assistant at the time, and when he found out that my girlfriend and soon-to-be wife was working with another distinguished professor on campus, he invited us, all of us, to dinner at his house. Not long after we arrived, a subject came up which clearly made the other faculty member a bit nervous as he looked around the room at two current students. Without saying anything, his eyes said, "Don't you remember that there are students in the room?" But David saw this immediately and he stopped the conversation and assured everyone, "It's okay. Tonight we are gathering as friends. We are among friends here." I tell you that story because it's emblematic of what I have come to appreciate most about not just David, Jeffrey the person, but David the scholar and teacher. David has taught me almost everything I know about how to read books, and certainly everything I know about how to read an image, which is why I'm so excited about tonight's lecture. And tonight, I'd like to draw your attention to what he's taught me about friendship. As a young graduate student, I was just elated to be included as one of the gang. David certainly meant this, or something like this, but I've come to appreciate over the years through David's actions, even more so than his words, that he meant so much more than that. He's taught me that Christian friendship isn't really about knowing someone outside office hours or having access to their posts on Facebook, though it could be part of it. Rather, he's taught me that friendship has everything to do with, indeed, is unintelligible apart from, the living that call to love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. And this quality is at the heart of all the books David has published. There's no doubt the engine behind the book, I'm happy to say, he has just completed on the arts of the holy. But what David's CV won't tell you is that his most important work for the last 20 years has been devoted to helping younger scholars like myself make their way in an all too treacherous world, many of whom are also here tonight. So what David's example has taught me is that friendship is not, as we might typically use the word, in spite of or separate from our roles as teacher and student, but rather the very thing that makes true learning possible. The records show I was no less a student for being invited into David's friendship. In fact, I soon realized that the gift he gave of himself, the generosity he extended in receiving me, and all my naivety and deficiency, was both the form and content of what we were learning. Whether we were reading Chaucer or Bede's commentaries or the Bible itself, what he was always teaching us was to develop a posture of self-examination and self-giving, such that we might be prepared as possible to receive whatever was before us. All of which was a kind of prologue leading into the real subject matter of David's teaching, scholarship, and personal life. The full life made possible by the triune friendship extended to us in the life and death and resurrection of Christ. So, if Augustine and many others have suggested, friends are a gift by which God draws us nearer to God's self, friendship is quite literally a schooling of Christian love, and it's no exaggeration to say that precisely as my teacher, not as my friend, David has been one of my truest friends. Thus, I count it no small privilege to say that whatever follows next is another way of David Jeffrey saying to all of us, it's okay, tonight we're gathering as friends. Please join me in welcoming my good friend, David Jeffrey.
Well, I've just begun to get the heat under my collar to die down a little while. And then there was that introduction, which raises it right back up there again. I think in the interest of truth, I'm not saying that what those folks said tonight was untrue. But what I am saying is there's such a thing as the whole truth. And the whole truth about the teacher-student relationship, as surely a very large number of you know, is that the student who engages the experience is as much or more a blessing to the teacher as the other way around. And because there's one student and there's one teacher and many students, right? The teacher is multiply blessed by the experience. And you get to a certain stage in your life as a teacher and you realize, I am richer than I ever could have hoped to be in the things that matter most in time and in eternity because of the blessings that come back from students. So that's just to balance the record a wee bit, okay? Because it was a little embarrassing there for a while. Okay, Daniel mentioned that this is coming out of a book which I've just finished. I think probably the actual title, rather than the working title, will be something like In the Beauty of Holiness, Art and Worship in the Christian West. And it's just finished. I just finished it this week. So I'm going to be giving you something out of more or less the midsection of that book. And what I'm trying to do in the book is I'm trying to track fundamental Christian ideas about the role that beauty has in relationship to our desire to be holy worshipers of a holy God. I mean, it's just that simple. There's a lot of art that hangs on this. There's a tremendous amount of great poetry hangs on this. There's a tremendous amount of great music hangs on this. And I just have to take one little slice out of it And the slice I'm taking is something that puts us close to the area that we work in. Not that I'm going to give you so much poetry, but because I'm going to get us to think about the way people have read the Bible. And tonight we're going to look at how various artists read the Bible and what they thought they saw. And one of the things that you know if you're a scholar of some periods especially is it's not just the commentators on Scripture historically that give us a sense of the fullness of the Word as we compare them with each other and we use them as a kind of choir singing to us about the truth of God's Word. But the poets and the painters have been commentators too, and those poets and painters sometimes have influenced the Bible commentators, right? So that it's a wonderful loop which gets ever richer as we go forward with it. So this is a wee, narrow slice here tonight. Let's see if I can keep myself focused after all those things that were said on what I want to talk about. The story of Bathsheba and King David remains perhaps the best known exemplar of voyeurism and its consequences in biblical tradition. The focus in exegesis and literary paraphrase has been overwhelmingly on King David, his lust, abuse of power, murder of Bathsheba's noble husband Uriah, his later exposure by Nathan the prophet and abject repentance, captured in the magnificent biblical poem Miserere Mei Domine, Psalm 51. But while that poem of repentance has been set to music often and brilliantly, you can think about Desprez, Bird, Gabrieli, Schutz, Allegri, those are among some of the best settings. The manuscript illustrators, printmakers, and painters have tended to linger over the initial scene in this sequence much more than on the repentance. This is 2 Samuel chapter 11 we're talking about. And in a way, what I want to say is that I suppose because they're visually oriented, the people that were doing visual arts were unable to turn their eyes of the imagination very far away from the fair Bathsheba herself. It's as though they see the story from the tempted David's point of view rather than that of Nathan the prophet, or the narrator, or the chronicler, or later commentators. To these artists, the repentance of David is of much less interest than his sin. The disposition to focus on Bathsheba involves, of course, artistic license, even a deliberate imposition on the biblical narrative. The case is far from unusual, as you may know. Biblical narrative may even be said to invite such interpolations because of its sparseness. But traditionally, any imaginative filling of the gaps is to some degree constrained, forced back to the original text for credible warrant. In regard to any imaginary character development in literary or artistic treatment, ordinarily there must be some plausible prompt or kernel of suggestion in the original biblical account if there's going to be credibility. To wit, in our example, a possible question in the mind of the reader, reading 2 Samuel 11, may arise as to whether Bathsheba was, in her own way, stark naked out there on the roof, seeking the attention which came to her. On this matter, the text, though cryptic, leaves everything to your imagination. Subsequent aspects of the narrative development being what they are, imagination has not been wanting, even from the first, to gratify a variety of desires for amplification of the story. In early etymologies, Jewish etymologies given for her name, there are already hints. Bathsheba suggests, says one Talmudic commentator, daughter of fullness. Another says, well-endowed daughter. Hubba hubba, you should write that in the margin, I guess. And while later Jewish commentaries soften that somewhat, suggesting that the meaning is a fine quality of figs, that's in Sanhedrin 107, and I thought that was a nice euphemism, and then I realized that it really was a euphemism, and I found it again. Erotic overtones are lingering all over the interpolations concerning her name. In the Chronicles, a later text than 2 Samuel, in which she is remembered chiefly as the mother of the 4 sons of David, her name is given as Bathsheba. That's 1 Chronicles 3:5 for you theologians. And more narrowly, what that means is daughter of opulence, like, the affluent one. A suggestion that in the light of history of the kings of Israel, there was need by this point to turn the focus away from her seduction by David to her royal role as mother of Solomon. This shift is more emphatically expressed when she is cited in later Jewish commentary of the Talmudic period. Bathsheba now becomes one of the 22 virtuous women, and even regarded as possibly the wise woman celebrated in the last chapter of Proverbs as the mother of Lemuel or Solomon. This rather impressive Jewish makeover fails to carry over into medieval and early Christian commentary, however. There, from the Fathers through the Glossa Ordinaria, Bathsheba is remembered only minimally as the occasion of a great sin by an otherwise largely noble king, through whom the Messiah descends. Despite Bathsheba's indispensable role in that descent, there's already a hint of embarrassment in Matthew's genealogy, where her name disappears and she becomes, quote, her that was wife to Uriah. Though the grievousness of David's sin is not entirely elided, the focus has shifted somewhat away from his act of adultery to his murder of Bathsheba's first husband. This lingering embarrassment relates in patristic exegesis to the requirements of typology, of which we've heard quite a bit today. The early commentators cannot avoid seeing David as an antitype of Christ. Accordingly, various forms of exculpation of David rather than of Bathsheba, different in strategy but not in purpose from those in Haggadic commentary, are employed either to downplay the Bathsheba incident or even allegorize it away. St. Augustine is representative of the first stratagem in his On Christian Doctrine, in which he excuses David as, quote, not lustful, though he did fall into adultery. Elsewhere, the diminished focus on Bathsheba shifts almost entirely toward her later life, when her intervention secures Solomon's ascendancy to the throne. And that permits the Middle English author of the Cursor Mundi, for example, to minimize the seduction scene to under 4 lines, and to develop her character rather more positively and certainly far more extensively in terms of her display of rhetorical skill as a kingmaker, pleading for Solomon over Adonijah. More cryptic still is St. Bonaventure, who just overlooks David's lapsus calumny altogether, manages to make several comments on the passage and doesn't notice. A minimalist approach to Bathsheba's beauty and its consequences may have seemed to medieval commentators a kind of charity toward the larger narrative. Gregory the Great exemplifies, perhaps even originates, a more demanding allegorical strategy for regal exculpation in his ingenious account in the Moralia in Job. And I'm going to read this quotation, just listen. It very often happens that a circumstance is sometimes in the performance of the action a ground for condemnation, but in the writing a prophecy of merit. For who that hears of it does not utterly loathe this, that David, walking upon his solarium, saw and lusted after Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah? But of whom does David, walking upon the terrace, prefigure, other than that one of whom it is written, he has set his tabernacle in the sun? And what else is it to draw Bathsheba to himself, but to join to himself by a spiritual meaning the law of the formal letter, which had been united previously to a carnal people? This raises the rabbinic art of saving the appearances to a whole new level, you know? And Gregory goes on to etymologize Bathsheba, his unexplained substitute for her name, as the seventh well, which alias lets him slide on into a still more ingenious allegory about the yielding of the knowledge of the law to spiritual wisdom. Such moves, however awkward, presage later medieval tradition. Gregory's purloined etymology becomes the Sevenfold Well in the Glossa Ordinaria, where it contributes to the iconography of Bathsheba's bathing scene and the resulting temptation of King David, allowing for a loose conflation with Jesus' discourse with the Samaritan woman by the well, and the superposition of more modest iconography appropriate to that later New Testament episode. Also in the glossa, St. Eucharius and St. Isidore of Seville's etymology, his etymologies are like a big dictionary of biblical items. Those are invoked to represent Bathsheba as a type of the law. And it says in the glossa, her seduction and later marriage to David was a liberation from the carnal letter of the law and marriage to its spirit. You can see the pattern here developing. And what's notable, I think, when you study the history of exegesis, it's interesting to see who really counts as a major influence. And Gregory the Great counts far more than people sometimes realize. His typological associations form the basis of subsequent convention and allegory, despite their rough disjunction with the story at its literal level. Thus, in the Aurora, or Biblia Versificata of Peter Riga, Bathsheba is described as the denuded law, divested of its legal encumbrances, and hence, I'll give you the Latin phrase here, it's a little easier to say in the next crowd, that candida scriptorum that Christ loves. Riga's language in this passage manages to be oddly suggestive, and maybe reflective also of another passage in Augustine, in which, to make a moral point, he was unable to evade the literal level of the narrative. Those who are susceptible to the lust of the eye, Augustine had suggested, ought to be warned by this story, to raise not complying eyes to strange balconies, to strange terraces. From afar, David saw her with whom he was captivated. Woman afar, lust near. Carnal pleasure, especially if directed toward unlawful and strange objects, is to be bridled, not let loose, by governance to be tamed, not set up as a principle of governance. That's in a talk he gave to the seminarians, and I suppose it has its place. Now, what's perhaps surprising and yet of primary interest in our present context is that this mainstream of traditional Christian exegesis, a moral or tropological reading of the story, in which Bathsheba figures as an irresistible temptation to carnal appetite, receives much less attention in medieval literature than it does in medieval art. Later on, the temptation seen in its moral dimensions are accented both in commentary and book illustration, especially in the period immediately following upon the Reformation. Martin Luther still regards the incident of David's adultery typologically and at the literal level, in a rather matter-of-fact fashion, is something not even to bother to pause over too much. Though the problem presented by the text may have seemed for the medieval theologian primarily the challenge of maintaining David's exemplary role after his adultery, in Luther's reading there's no trace of comparable concern. Like his disciple Philip Melanchthon, who, by the way, recommended a second wife to Henry VIII, he's among the many recommenders, Luther was inclined to be untroubled by polygamy in general, let alone polygamy amongst biblical kings and patriarchs and that sort of person. John Calvin, however, entirely self-consistently, is neither indulgent of David's miscreants nor much interested in Bathsheba's predicament one way or the other. For him, distinctively, the illicit liaison is just one more indication, and I'm quoting him here, that the sovereign purposes of God and salvation history are not dependent upon the virtues or the vices of any human protagonist. That's real Calvin. Calvin's view of David's sexual misadventure is that it offered a warning which should have been heeded by the Jews collectively, so that this human misconduct, an ugly episode at the start of the kingdom, should have stopped the Jews from glorying in the flesh. But God wished to testify to the Jews that he gave no weight to human merits. That seems rather dry and unsatisfying from a literary point of view, if you'll forgive me. Yet, despite Luther's apparent lack of surprise at David's bold sin and Calvin's dismissive generalization, Protestant artistic treatment of this story over the next few decades, as we'll see, tends increasingly toward a kind of psychological realism and eroticism. As we shall see, this development becomes at least as interesting in its own modest way as the far more frankly erotic treatment by Catholic artists. And finally, we're going to get at the end of this talk to Rembrandt, who, as we will begin to see, comes up with something much more novel and from a literary point of view, much more compelling than many of his contemporaries or predecessors. The biblical narrative is famously terse where physical or physiological description is concerned. According to the biblical narrative, from his rooftop garden, David rises up in the bed, from his bed in the Herev. By the way, you have to watch your translations here. The ESV, which is generally a really good translation, has a bit of exculpation going on right here because it translates this as late one afternoon from his couch. But that's not what the text says. It says he got up from his bed in the evening. That's a long siesta. And that suggests a kind of an extremity of indolence or something like unto it, which the text clearly wants you to pick up in the Hebrew. And then David is wandering around, having sort of come to consciousness, and he looks down into the courtyard of a nearby house to see a woman washing herself. And the text says, and the woman was very beautiful. At least that's a translation. It's a euphemism. The Hebrew is much more explicit. The Hebrew text says she was tovoth mramad, of extremely good shape. The Hebrew's often quite frank, And this follows, naturally, the rather earthy confirmations of female comeliness suggested by etymologies of her names in Hebrew. But it also highlights the problem. Though obviously sexually appealing, her roof tops the house of another man. From the biblical narrative, we do not know to what degree she was unclothed while bathing, but if we are to assume that her bathing was ritual purification following menstruation, then perhaps her drapery was minimal to non-existent. In early medieval illustration, this probability is distinctly muted. As this particular illustration, which I want to show you, do I have this right? There, from Peter Comesser's Biblia Versificata. So here we are looking at a versified Bible of the 13th century, and we have an illustration, and all that's going on here is she's combing out her wet hair. You have to say that's fairly innocent, right? Manuscripts of the 13th century Biblia Moralisée can be just a little bit more explicit, but not much. But if you look at books of hours by the late 15th and early 16th century, you'll see some things that are a bit more risque, even though it is not the narrative in 2 Samuel, but Psalm 51 that they are ostensibly illustrating. So in the penitential Psalms of a book about 1524 found in the museum in The Hague, Bathsheba stands erect in the fountain. This is illustrating Psalm 51 now. And you see a couple things here that an art historian or a visually arts trained person will notice that her breast may be partially exposed to the prurient gaze of the king, but her buttocks are partially exposed to the viewer. And this is partly about voyeurism in the viewer, right? It's not just about voyeurism in King David. There's something else going on here. And it follows an earlier miniature, also in the same museum for Psalm 51, in which the viewer sees a near frontal full exposure of Bathsheba standing in a pool, and David sees her back only. This is a stratagem which, by the way, there's a lot of examples of, and it's very clear that the viewer gets to see what David cannot quite, and is thus, even more directly than the king himself, so to speak, enticed as a voyeur. Now these are manuscripts produced either in monastic houses or in fraternal houses. No more comment on that, but you can think about it. So early Lutheran book illustration follows this approach to varying degrees, and generally with more modesty, notably as an illustration for Martin Luther's printed commentary on the 7 penitential psalms that came out in 1525. But there's equally apparent among the flood of Bathsheba representations of the 16th century a yet more modest mean emerging. For example, this is the New German Catechism of 1531. And you can see here that the Bathsheba is fully clothed. She's in a pool, and she's not on a rooftop. She's down in a garden on the ground to make it possible for her to be having her feet washed. And that particular gesture is something that gets picked up by Lucas Cranach in his 1526 oil painting. And it shows David and a group of courtiers looking down upon this elegantly attired Bathsheba among her ladies in waiting, one of whom makes as if to wash her extended foot. Now, all those of you who have studied Hebrew will know that the euphemism here is a learned one in Hebrew. It's where you get feet standing for genitalia. The word in Hebrew is regel, and sometimes feet appears in your translation when it's clearly genitalia that is mentioned. The King James does this on a routine basis. That's probably behind the iconography, right? And it's a post-menstrual ritual purification is probably intended here, and so the euphemism, if you get it, is perfectly sensible. This Lutheran iconographic turn to modesty, which appears in illustrations also with a Swiss-German dialect translation, Die ganze Bibel, sometimes called the Zurich Bible, here is illustrating the narrative in Samuel itself. It's also found in Michael Helding's Catholic Catechism, so I want to show you that, Catholic treatments of this by this period. And there's a lot going on in these first 3 or 4 decades of the 16th century in which people are beginning to react against some of the excessively explicit illustrations before on both the Catholic and the Protestant side. So I want you to see that that's going on. After mid-century, however, third-generation Protestants in their illustrations seem happy enough to revert to more frankly erotic descriptions of partial to full female nudity. And that's a bigger story that I can tell you tonight, but one sees this especially in editions of Luther's translation of the Bible, but also in a work attributed variously to Philip Melanchthon and Johannes Coglerus, essentially catechetical, entitled Elegant Images, 1558. And in this work, the Bathsheba scene illustrates the 6th commandment against adultery. So this is for little kids, by the way. So you teach them their catechism. I can't see my father having approved of that. In the same period, catechism for children may display Bathsheba more discreetly, mostly clothed, with a little less than legs bare to mid-thigh, while David is usually doing just what you've seen in many of these illustrations. He's leering over the balcony, strumming his harp. And in later Calvinist catechetical literature, one can observe a more generalized concern regarding the perils and all such visual indulgence. Let me see, do I have another one? Yeah, that's the one I wanted to get you to in a second here. Calvin thinks that the reason why you have, erotic representations of the Bathsheba story is because that's the way the Romans really are. They just can't help themselves. They're just lascivious. And so I'll quote, you think I'm exaggerating, but listen to this. So he says, "What are the pictures or statues to which the Romans append the names of saints, but exhibitions of the most shameless lechery or obscenity? Indeed, brothels exhibit their inmates more chastely and modestly dressed than Catholic churches do images intended to represent virgins." Not that Calvin ever went into hyperbole or anything, right? So you might expect that kind of a view from Calvin and recognize his scruple as presaging the image-free whitewashed churches of Protestant Amsterdam, such as in their clean, well-lighted, austere beauty so fascinated the painter Saint-Rene. But such a viewpoint, or something very like it, appears at the turn of the century with no less stern an admonition and pedagogical ingenuity in the Jesuit Jan David's Christlichen Weersäger. Now, what's happened in the meantime? Well, in the meantime, we've had a thing called the Council of Trent. Right? And the Council of Trent plays a big role here. So here, along comes a Jesuit, Jan David, and really he wants to take a view that's not all that far removed from Calvin. He avoids the rhetoric, but the point is very clear. So here what he's showing us here is a diagram of the human skull as a house of the mind, showing the eyes as portals for visual temptation with textual accompaniment warning against any unconscious gaze, the text says, which may allow the eyes to become a gateway for the entrance of sin. This is an old motif, by the way. It goes all the way back to St. Augustine in his Sermon on the Mount commentary on Matthew 5:28. In this book, it is illustrated by articulated mechanical notions of the operation of the phantasm. It goes in through the eyes and fires your imagination, and leading it to culpable delectatio cogitationis. That's what you're not supposed to get into, right? It's when you sit there and think about it too much, and you make fantasies in your mind. Such warnings seem not to have been much heeded, however, by the illustrators and painters on either side of the Reformation divide, who were Jan David's contemporaries. Many of these painters seem to be much more attracted to Bathsheba than to King David. And moreover, there is in some of their work evident adumbration of the Bathsheba narrative with classical stories of temptation and seduction. There's an evident recollection of the myth of Venus and Adonis, for example, in this particular painting by Jan Massis. And if you look at that, you'll see it's still got the basic characteristics of the earlier iconography for this story. But now we have something that is produced by a guy who spent a little bit of time because he got into trouble with the Catholic Church. He's been exiled from the country for a while. He's gone down to Italy and he's seen what the Italians are doing, and they really know what to do with classical stories and how to work those things in some kind of pseudo-allegorical way right into the text that they want to illustrate from the Bible. And so you have this emissary courtier for David, who is greeting a nearly nude Bathsheba, bowing as he does so with extended leg. And by the way, the iconography of that is absolutely explicit. And he's simultaneously pointing aloft to his waiting master, almost as if in parody of some sort of representation of the Annunciation. The courtier is accompanied by a hunting hound of the sort one might associate with Adonis. It evidently starts up Bathsheba's spaniel, which for its own part responds rather more playfully than in any convincing show of resistance. In this painting, Bathsheba's response is coquettish bemusement, while that of her attendants is a kind of sympathetic titillation. After this period, by the way, the lady spaniel is increasingly present in the iconography of this scene, of David's immodest proposal. But whereas in medieval iconography, of a heroine of amour courtois, such a canine might have been a reminder of a virtue. If you see, for example, a picture of a lady and she's got a wee dog at her feet, that dog is a representation of her fidelity of life. You know, that's why we got the name Fido for dogs, right? From fides, faith, and by this period it's breaking down. And so Massi shows you some of the ways it's breaking down. So if you know any paintings by Tiziano Vecellai, Titian, right? You might know his Danae or his Venus of Urbino, and those are nudes, and if you take a look at them, you'll see that there'll be a little dog in the picture of the sort that you might expect to be Fido, but the dog's asleep, suggesting that the guardian of fidelity is off duty, or even more cynically, that fides is a losing proposition in today's world, you know, that kind of thing. In numerous other examples of Counter-Reformation depictions of Bathsheba in her bath, the dog is dispensed with then altogether in the interest of an undistracted visual bacchanalia, more like an Orientalist imagination of a harem bath scene than anything that you could connect with a biblical story. Now, not for nothing was Jan David concerned with perils of an incautious gaze, as his text put it. These are Catholic painters post-Council of Trent, painting this scene, by the way, for bishops' palaces and for churches. So Calvin wasn't crazy, right? Some of these things are really hard, and you wouldn't know what you're looking at if you didn't have a title. You have to be given the title. So you have the idea here. Now, the most famous Counter-Reformation painter by far is Peter Paul Rubens. Very successful, made oodles of money doing what he did because his work was in high demand in the private sector, as we might say, as well as in the ecclesiastical sector. And he has a very famous version of, nope, that's Artemisia. I should have given you this before. That's another one of those post-Counter-Reformation things. So much for that. Okay, here we got Peter Paul Rubens. You know, this is a painting which I suppose doesn't entirely lose its connection with the biblical warrant. But you see that the general development you've been looking at for the last few minutes has kind of reached an apogee here. Rubens, arranges things in such a way as to invite the viewer of the art to experience vicariously precisely the temptation to which King David has succumbed. David himself has a prospect on Bathsheba's nudity only from behind. He can't see really anything. And his minimized shadow is executed in the manner of Hans Memling's Bathsheba or Luther's penitential psalms. The viewer, on the other hand, sees what the artist sees. Rubens' Bathsheba was painted almost simultaneously with his flamboyantly lascivious Susanna and the Elders, the Susanna story from the apocryphal Daniel 13, having become another favorite subject amongst Counter-Reformation painters, largely selling these things to the same clientele that they were selling the canonical biblical scenes. Now, by the way, this do I have a? Yeah, that's the other one. The model is the same in both of these paintings. It's Rubens' 16-year-old wife. He married her when he was 53. So, whatever the merit of this theory in respect to his choice of a model, her depiction in his Bathsheba is frankly sensual and cheerfully erotic, without a hint of any interest either in typology or moral instruction. That's just gone. Though Rubens' father had been a persecuted Calvinist, and after his father's death he had been raised in Catholic piety of very serious intensity by his mother, this painting is in effect, whoops, I'm one ahead of myself. This painting and this painting are both effectively secular works of art. They have ceased to really negotiate or to dialogue with the biblical text in a meaningful or useful way. Okay. One may say on the evidence, in fact, that though Rubens was a leading figure in the Counter-Reformation amongst Counter-Reformation painters, Baroque painters, his popularity with wealthy patrons, including ecclesiastics, was for just such voluptuous depictions. So if you take out a reasonably thorough catalog of Rubens' paintings, you'll see that this is where his bread and butter was, so to speak. So what do you see here in the Bathsheba? Well, you see Bathsheba seated, provocatively semi-draped, after her bath, having her hair combed by her young maidservant. Her aspect is coquettish and casual. Looped loosely around her left arm, where it rests on the fountain, is an unclasped string of pearls, and that iconographically, by the way, suggests her availability. A black servant boy presents her with a note from the king, who, like the lecherous elders in many a Susanna painting, leers down from the middle distance of his palace balcony. Bathsheba herself is presented as nubile but very young, and she has an more than enticing smile for the messenger. Oblivious to the agitated barking of her appropriately protective spaniel, she seems far more alert in every sense to a new opportunity. Rubens paints her quite precisely as though she had been expecting this message all along. This is a reading of the biblical narrative in which Bathsheba is at the very least complicitous in the affair that is about to take place. Rubens' painting quite deliberately also occasions a certain complicity, of course, in the viewer who looks at the painting. Now, when you get to Rembrandt, by contrast, and there's lots of contrast between these two painters, there occurs an artistic breakthrough of almost the entire set of conventions to which Rubens was the optimal heir. And in particular, a rejection of the focus of centuries of biblical commentary, iconography, and Christian catechesis. Rembrandt shows himself in many paintings to be as uninterested as Rubens in the typical didacticism of Protestant catechisms, or the patristic and medieval allegory, which served primarily to exculpate David, but I think for quite different reasons. Rembrandt considers this story, as he does many other narratives, from the viewpoint of the character who, in most other treatments, is in fact simply a fair object, an occasion of temptation. And he reflects on her as one who rather suffers indignity, alienation, and loss. And while his first Bathsheba at her toilette it had been to some degree within the older iconographic tradition. It was a commissioned painting. It eventually left him unsatisfied. So that was in 1643. In his second effort in 1654, it's on Bathsheba alone that he chooses to focus. And so what he does is he strips away most of the other figures altogether from his canvas. There is no messenger. From the crumbling of the paper in her right hand, we may gather that Bathsheba has already read this letter many times. Her hair has already been coiffed for her assignation. Only the pedicure, dimly recollecting the iconographic washing of the feet, remains to be completed. And now by a much older, partially obscured attendant. All sense of adventure has disappeared. Weighed down in somber reflection, her flesh textured and toned so as to suggest premature aging, this Bathsheba is torn in anguish between fidelity to her husband and what she must have seen as inescapable acquiescence to the king's imperious lust. There is in Rembrandt's more attuned psychological perspective no need for an unclasped string of pearls or for an ineffectually barking dog. Moreover, though as in many earlier treatments, Bathsheba is presented almost frontally and completely nude, no comparable voyeurism is invited by the artist toward the viewer of the painting. Indeed, unlike Rubens' version, this painting has an almost counter-erotic force, amply warranting Hélène Cixous in her judgment that it isn't with the appetite of desire that Rembrandt paints this Bathsheba. Rembrandt's chiaroscuro, like his dramatic exclusion from the scene of all elements except her own personal crisis and weighty sadness, underscores the ethical dimension of the biblical narrative not from David's or the voyeur's, but from Bathsheba's point of view. He thus both reinterprets and repositions the story itself in the reader's mind. Rembrandt's masterpiece is that of one who reads the biblical story with an eye for the personal in biblical narrative rather than for catechesis, which is to say, he's not thinking about doctrines of justification or about exculpation of, or even about David's eventual repentance and the history of human salvation. He's rather exhibiting compassionate identification with the victim, her sad betrayal by a tyranny of lust and power. We see this deliberate inculpation plainly also in his painting of David and Uriah, where he turns the viewer's attention to the plight and the thoughts of the doomed Uriah. And as you can tell from looking at the painting, it's not a perfect image, but you can tell that Uriah knows. He's been sent away, and he knows. In terms of the prompting biblical narrative, those two works form a kind of diptych. Now, what I want to suggest tonight is that these two paintings of the king's incipient sexual conquest and subsequent betrayal of the wronged husband, there you can put them together, are metonymic for Rembrandt's great overall artistic breakthrough. Rembrandt offers a freshness in approach to the traditional topos made possible precisely by turning away from catechesis and traditional typology, without, as in Rubens, a corresponding loss of the subject's religious dimension. What seems to make this counterintuitive success possible is a meditative and reflectively sympathetic reading of the Bible as participated, imagined narrative. Though this is not exclusively a Protestant achievement, actually, in some of his techniques, he's anticipated by Masaccio and Caravaggio. Rembrandt's realization of the potential of terse biblical narrative for a dramatic realization of inner character becomes a kind of tour de force of biblical interpretation in this work, and at the same time a subversion of the voyeurism which had increasingly characterized much of the earlier depiction of Bathsheba as subject. His 1654 Bathsheba is accordingly, I think, an important moment in the history of style. Rembrandt's version of an affectual breakthrough in representing biblical narrative is almost as dramatic as that first achieved 3 centuries earlier in the frescoes of Giotto. Now, just a couple thoughts here. That the Church Catholic has had conflicting views regarding protocol for the making of Christian images, especially where nudity is concerned, is recently well known. As recently as 1994, in a homily addressing controversy over nudity in the figures of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel painting, cleaned in '84, Pope John Paul II defended the depiction of nude Adam and Eve as appropriate to the text of Genesis and useful for addressing questions about the theology of the body. These theological matters he took up in a separate text, distinguishing between representations of what he calls original man before the fall, historical man after the fall, and eschatological man who partakes of the divine nature in heaven. To each of these contexts in representation, different conventions, he says, need to apply with respect to nudity. In historical figures after the fall, we have historical man stripped of the glory of primal innocence so that the nakedness has lost its possibility of innocent depiction. On this view, nudity for historical figures from the Bible has become unsuitable for portrayal in ecclesiastical settings, but not so nudity in Edenic or eschatological contexts where it can still be appropriate. I want to stress that this was not a protocol yet established in the time of Rubens and Rembrandt. For in that era, there were strongly divergent views of this matter within the Catholic Church, as well as divergence from Protestants themselves of quite different minds from each other. The Council of Trent was concerned to counteract not only Protestant iconoclasm, but also what it considered to be excessively lascivious and even pagan representations of the body in Catholic ecclesial art. One of the very things that Church Catholic had been criticized for by some Reformation voices. Section 25 of the publication of Trent is entitled On the Invocation, Veneration, and Relics of Saints and or Sacred Images. And it was accordingly an initial attempt to constrain the sort of images you've been looking at in people like Memling, Massis, and late medieval books of ours. And I'm going to quote from the council here, if you'll permit me. All lasciviousness should be avoided, in such wise that figures shall not be painted or adorned with a beauty exciting lust. There cannot be There can be nothing seen that is disorderly, or that is unbecomingly or confusedly arranged, nothing that is profane, nothing indecorous, seeing that holiness becometh the house of God. And that these things may be the more faithfully observed, the Holy Synod ordains that no one be allowed to place or cause to be placed any unusual image in any place or church, howsoever exempted, except that image have been approved by a bishop. That was a noble effort. Earlier, the defense of Eck against Luther's objection had been to say that the problem was not the artwork itself, but the miscreant imagination of viewers, just such as Martin Luther. That is to say, the concupiscence was entirely in the eye of the beholder, for Eck talking about Luther. And this was, before too long, perceived as an insufficient justification by Catholics as well as Protestants. So Pope Pius IV, in the years immediately following the council, ordered that sexual organs and any such nude imageries in sanctuaries be covered with overpainting. So fig leaves soon appear on the regalia, if I can use that word, of naked Adams and Eves, such as in this example by Masaccio is a pretty good example. Some of you know that the one on the left, the overpainted version, is the one that Rubens would agree to put on in 1992 on the cover of the Dictionary of Biblical Tradition and English Literature. Even though the cleaned up version was available, it's kind of comforting to me to see these residual effects of a Calvinist formation still working. And so you have in other paintings, and if you don't get fig leaves, what you get is floral drapes or floral screening, and Jan David's work is clearly echoing the judgment of Pius IV rather than of Eck here. And for the historian of art, especially one interested in art as a register of theological reflection and reading practices for the Bible, art apologetics in the post-Tridentine era offer a lot of interesting insights. For example, Helio de Fabriano, a Roman theologian, both advocates for biblical art and he takes a very dim view of what he regards as the erotic excesses of high mannerist painting. He wrote a big book on this subject. In that book, he attacks one of the very artworks that Pope John Paul II was most concerned to defend, Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. Two notable bishops attacked that painting as indecent on the standards of the Council of Trent. I think that the Pope, Pope John Paul II, who's a very admirable fellow, I think he must have known that, but he decided to go in a different direction. Helio objects to what he deems the inclusion of distracting trivialities. I'm translating his Latin here. Namely, the semi-nude body of any number of people, including the returning Christ. And he asks the question, he says, why do we want to have the returning Christ half naked standing next to Charon, who comes from a classical text and there's nothing biblical about him on this great painting in the Sistine Chapel? And he argues, almost as a Protestant critic might, against the perils of artistic virtuosity, leading both artists and their patrons to impious arrogance. And he inveighs against syncretism, a biblical and pagan story, which he thought posed very grave risks to theological orthodoxy. Farther north, up in the lowlands, Johannes Molanus, Jan Vermeulen, I guess he would be in Dutch, although he only wrote in Latin. He was a professor of theology at the Louvain, and he had begun to address these issues as early as 1568 in a book which he wrote about the history of holy images and pictures. He also wrote a commentary on Council of Trent, and he revised and published that twice in his lifetime. Molanus is primarily concerned to banish the narratives of apocryphal books from the Bible. Get rid of all that stuff that's not canonical, he asks. And he wants not only the stories of Susanna, but also, images of the Assumption of the Virgin, since they're not canonical, exiled from Catholic painting. One can only guess what he would have thought of Rubens' Intercession of the Virgin in St. Francis, or Gian Lanfranco's Assumption of Magdalene. There's some really humdinger paintings in this period. I think because this is a good Christian school, I did not. Oh, I brought that one. I thought I didn't. That's the Assumption of Mary Magdalene. But you didn't know that was going to happen, or did it happen, right? It was painted many times. But Paliotti is another bishop, Cardinal Archbishop of Bologna. He has a ringing critique of this sort of thing. which he calls Ovidian immoralities, charging biblical scenes with purely erotic potential for purely erotic purposes. And for Paleotti, these paintings were particularly damaging to the moral formation of the illiterate poor, who lack any sophistication to read anything like this in some sort of allegorical fashion. And he says you can only expect to confuse them or be pornographically enticing them. And so he takes the same position. St. Charles Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan, and his cousin Cardinal Federico Borromeo, both wrote against these materials. So that's a lot of high-powered Catholic hierarchy taking positions against it. So, did it work? Nope. No, it didn't. One of the things that is just true, and we have to reckon with this, is that a position that people will widely regard as theologically correct and rationally defensible will succumb to pressures of the marketplace. It happened then, it still happens. So, as we've seen, let me wrap up here. 16th century Lutheran examples of the depiction of 2 Samuel 11 generally distinguish themselves from Catholic representations in their attempt to avoid nudity and in a more general modesty and visualized euphemism. It should be noted that all of our available Protestant examples, except for the painting that I showed you by Lucas Cranach, are engravings for printed Bibles and catechisms, where illustration rather than artistic interpretation of a biblical text is their purpose. Calvinist art for our subject, though sparse after this period, goes in another direction, especially after Rubens, especially after Rembrandt. And so I'm going to show you just a couple things. Here, Rembrandt was not only a painter, but he was a teacher. Rembrandt, I hope you'll see, attempted something really quite remarkable, but he had a couple of students, his very most famous students. I'm going to show you their attempts at the same thing. And I want to suggest that if you don't have a title here, you don't know what this painting is about with connection to the Bible. William Druss is a very fine student of painting, and this is a very well executed painting. And there's another one by Govert Flink. And there you might make a guess because the crumpled up letter he has borrowed from his teacher's execution of this painting. But the problem is that these kinds of paintings can only by a kind of a force of intervention, be associated with a biblical story. And the intervention has to come in form of something you didn't ever get in paintings of this period, which is a great big title across the bottom of the painting or something like that in a gallery. So, what do we say about this? Well, really, what we have to say is the distinctive reader of Scripture in this period as a painter is Rembrandt von Rijn. Rembrandt just read the Bible in a different way than other people did. And the thing that made it possible for him to read the Bible and to see the personhood of the characters in the Bible, in other words, to read in a way a good literary critic we would hope would read, or to read in the way a novelist might read, is that he saw the Bible as best approached not through catechesis, not through doctrine, not through conventional iconography. He was willing to let all three of those things go so that he could get at what he thought was at the heart of things. And for him in that story, what's at the heart of things is the person who is victimized by the imperious lust and power of someone who's able to pull it off. And that if we just remove that from our reading of the story, we've missed something absolutely crucial that the Bible itself puts there for us to think about. Okay, thanks.